rainy morning, so I hope other people are having better weather than I am. I would like to welcome everyone to our World Conference on Qualitative Research Roundtable with Doctors Trena, Paulus and Jessica Lester, called Using Technology Meaningfully in Qualitative Research. So I'm Elizabeth Pope. I am an assistant professor of educational research at the University of West Georgia in Carrollton, Georgia, which, if anybody has any idea where that is or not, it is about an hour southwest of Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm very excited to be here and to learn a little bit more from Dr. Paulus and Dr. Lester for the hour that we're here. I would like to invite Dr. Paulus and Dr. Lester to introduce themselves briefly for us today. Dr. Paulus, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone, for the invitation. It's great to see everyone here today. I am joining you from Johnson City, Tennessee, in the northeast corner of the state. I'm a professor at East Tennessee State University. I'm also the director of undergraduate research and creative activities. One of my main jobs here now is to provide research support and training for researchers, faculty, and staff across campus. So it's nice to be with everybody today to talk about the role of technology in research.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lester.
Hi, everyone. Well, first, thank you, Dr. Pope and the other organizers of the conference for inviting us to be here today. It's going to be a fun time to learn from all of you and to think about these issues together. I'm an associate professor of inquiry methodology in the School of Education at Indiana University, which is located in Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States. I, in this role, work with primarily doctoral students in the areas of language-based methodologies and methods. And of course, as we all know, much of our work is now really intersecting with technologies, which we'll be able to engage with each other in thinking with today.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and the time of everyone who wanted to sign up to learn a little bit more from you both today. Today we will be here for about an hour or so. We'll ask the panelists a few questions. We'll leave time at the end for attendees to ask any questions they may have. And then we'll end the session with a few comments from Sonia about WCQR. So to start us off today, I would just like to dive in if y'all are ready. Oh, great. So my first question to kind of set the stage for our talk today is if you could just tell us about how qualitative researchers use digital tools and spaces in their research.
Sure. So I can start off with some thoughts on that. So this is the short answer is they use them a lot in a lot of different ways. And we have, I should say, for a very long time, used different tools and technologies to support qualitative research. But I would say we haven't spent a lot of time as a field thinking about the consequences of that for methodology and how we do our work. So Jessica and I, it's probably been 10 years ago now, really started digging into this. I have a background in instructional design and technology and qualitative research methods, and I thought it was really interesting that while we talk a lot about technology and teaching, and there's such a field as instructional technology, there's really no such thing as research technology or a real focus on research and technology. So we both kind of, through conversations with our students and colleagues, trying to find out more, where do we go for training to understand how to use technology in our research, there really was a gap there. Most people think about qualitative data analysis software when they think about technology and qualitative research. In fact, I saw the little ad for Web QDA. Or maybe they think about transcribing and how you're going to record your interviews and transcribe it, but that's kind of it. So we wanted to sort of provide guidance for how technology is impacting the entire research process. So I would challenge everybody to kind of think about, especially with this great international audience, how we use technology and tools for everything from reviewing the literature. We have citation management software now, or just databases that we can search. We have to think about technology in terms of data collection. We've got mobile apps now. We have social media as a data source. That's changing what it means to do qualitative research. We have different ways of transcribing those recordings. We do have data analysis software that we have to think about. And we also have to sort of think about the ethical issues around adopting new technologies, and also just new ways to share the findings with other people. So we wrote a book that was published in 2014 about digital tools for qualitative research, and we just released earlier this year kind of an updated version of that called Doing Qualitative Research in the Digital World, where we talk about how to create a digital workflow to support your entire qualitative process and kind of help people think through making sort of informed choices around that. Because I think, you know, we're all familiar with different tools that we use, but I think there's been less attention to how the decisions that we make matter and what the consequences are. And that's kind of where we are in our thinking around that we do use them, but then how are we using them and why, and what are the consequences? And Jessica, I don't know if you want to add a little bit to that or not.
No, I mean, I think you've covered kind of the main landscape of how folks are thinking about technologies in qual right now.
Thank you. So it sounds like using technology in qual really is a whole package. It's not just using it for one thing, or thinking, okay, I'll transcribe, or okay, I'll use qualitative data analysis system software. Excuse me. It's a connected package, right? That's the sense that I'm getting. So to start thinking about it as a connected package, what are your recommendations for researchers?
For how to think about it as a connected package? Well, you know, we make the argument in the book that one way to think about it is to really consider adopting qualitative data analysis software as a platform across the entire research process. So you're not just thinking about data analysis software when you have your data and you're ready to analyze it, but you think about how it can, because the packages can support doing your literature review using software, collecting data and transcribing it within the software package, because a lot of these software packages have mobile versions now. Of course, doing the analysis, but then using what are those things called, word cloud, or the different ways of representing the findings as sort of the images, the output of the decoding can actually go into your paper. So I think that that's one way we do make the argument. We have a whole chapter on how to think about data analysis software as the platform for the workflow, as a way to kind of be more coherent and consistent across the whole process.
And one of the things that we have written about and we think about together is the idea of not thinking about using a platform at the point of data analysis. And so integrating that actually into how you design your study from the very point of just beginning to think about what that study might be. So examining what kinds of digital tools and or spaces might intersect even with your thinking around theory. So if there are substantive theories or methodological theories that are informing your work, where might that intersect and even inform how you conceptualize the technologies that you take up? So really beginning to foreground your examination of technologies versus have it be something that just happens at the end or happens when you realize, wow, a technology might be useful here. Really thinking about it from the get-go, not just when it's potentially the most relevant.
I think that's really good advice for novice and seasoned researchers alike, and being sure that they're paying attention to how they're utilizing these technologies from the beginning of the project to the end. And one thing that I'm hearing is that use of technology in qualitative research has been around for a very long time, just like it's been around in teaching for a really long time. But I think a lot of us know through personal experience that the last year and a half has really maybe changed for some people, maybe not, but put technology use in the forefront of our mind in almost everything we do, from work life to personal life. And so I was hoping you could talk with us a little bit about how the use of digital tools and spaces in qualitative research has changed with the onset of COVID-19.
Sure, I'll get us started on that one. As you noted, Liz, I think indeed the onset of COVID-19 really shifted for many of us, perhaps all of us, what our day-to-day lives look like, both as just human beings navigating the world as well as qualitative researchers. For many qualitative researchers around the world, this has meant that engaging in qualitative research in digital spaces and with digital tools was really no longer a choice, and even a methodological choice. It was for many a mandate, and still is. Demands, for instance, of physical distancing really changed what it meant to collect data for some qualitative researchers, thinking about what does it mean to shift from in-person data collection to thinking about meeting in digital spaces. So those kinds of realities have really demanded that we really, for some of us, re-envision what our qualitative research practices look like in relation to digital tools and spaces. So I think we can no longer say things like, digital tools and spaces are for those folks that do virtual ethnography. Those are the folks that do that kind of work. I think all of us are really having to reckon with what does it mean to engage in and with the space. And so one of the things that I think about is, technology adoption is a layered and complex process, but it is generally understood as occurring within a community, like a qualitative research community, in particular contexts and under particular conditions. And so the COVID-19 pandemic has really set conditions for us to reckon with what does it mean to take up technologies in our practice. So I think what's also important to keep in mind is that some scholars have written that there really will be no return to the good old days. So being able to say things like, that's what the folks in digital humanities do, or what those folks that write around technologies do. It really is our opportunity here to think about what it means now, to think about engaging in digital tools and spaces. So at the same time, I think it's really important to keep in mind that yes, the landscape has changed for some people. But as you mentioned earlier, Liz, these are actually not new ideas. The qualitative methods literature around this is decades old. And there are many, many touch points that we can turn back to think about how to engage in digitized methodologies and to engage with, in meaningful ways, digital spaces and digital tools. So we're not starting from ground zero, so to speak. We have a lot of foundation that we can build upon. So the good news here is that we have plentiful examples and resources to turn towards as we begin to think about either transitioning projects that lived outside of digital spaces to digitized context, or beginning to envision an entire project in a way where we foreground digital spaces at the front end of the project.
Thank you. Dr. Paulus, do you want to add anything?
No, I think Dr. Lester's covered that in terms of, we're here. I don't know that we're going to go back fully to being able to think about doing everything face-to-face again. And so the more we can really attend to it methodologically in an informed way, the better off we're all going to be as researchers.
I appreciate this mindset of we're in this community, this research community that's now maybe more so than ever using technology together and apart. And we've been using these terms, digital tools, digital spaces. And before we go further, I was hoping that we could speak just a moment on the difference between digital tools and digital spaces and the relationship between the two.
Do you want me to tackle that, Jessica?
Sure.
Okay. So when we talk about, so it's funny, we didn't even make this distinction necessarily in the book that we wrote in 2014. And then we realized as we were writing it and going into this book that there is a difference between a digital tool which can be used for researchers to generate data. I think we use the distinction between researcher generated and naturally occurring, which is a little bit of a misnomer, but the difference between researchers going out and collecting data versus data that's sort of already out there. It's a digital space that researchers might be able to engage in and treat as data. So a digital tool would be something like Zoom as a tool to conduct interviews, or an app on your phone to record interviews, or a transcription software, a tool to turn your recordings into text. Whereas a digital space, we could treat what's happening here, this conference, pre-conference roundtable, as a digital space that might be able to answer some research questions, but we didn't design it for research. It's here, and we might decide that this would be great to do some research with the agreement of everyone. Or social media data, it's out there, people are talking to each other, and a lot of researchers are looking at that as a potential source of data. That's how I think about the difference between the two. And I do think it's an important distinction, because too often all of this stuff tends to get kind of mixed together when you're trying to parse out what you're doing and why.
Great, thank you. Before we moved on, I just wanted to be sure that we were all on the same page in exactly how we're using these two important terms. And Dr. Lester, you mentioned, and I think that we all feel this way, that using technology is no longer a choice, right? It's required. We have to do it in so many ways. And you mentioned that we need to re-envision our practices to more mindfully or powerfully use it. And so keeping that in mind, that we now in so many ways have to use it. I'm curious if y'all could talk about how does the move to digital tools and digital spaces impact issues like equity, diversity, and inclusion for both scholars and those people engaging in research as participants?
Trina, do you want to start us off on that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I've got a few things to address on that one, and then turn it over to Dr. Lester. So, and this is something that Jessica and I have talked about quite a bit, especially as we were finishing up this book when the pandemic was already underway. And so I think there were a lot of assumptions around the ability to move online, for example, but just from a teaching perspective or a work perspective, a workplace perspective, a lot of assumptions around diversity, equity, inclusion that were not necessarily accurate. And so I will say that we have not typically address this as much as we should have in our writing, but it's something we're really, obviously for a lot of us, it's on the forefront of our minds a lot. And just to how we're like thinking about these terms, I love this analogy that a researcher at the University of Michigan makes between diversity being everybody is invited to the party, right? So no matter what your characteristics are, race, ethnicity, gender, abilities, disability, but also especially for technology, socioeconomic status, education level, first language or language fluencies, and technology competence, that we want to invite everyone to participate in this conversation around technology and qualitative research. Inclusion is that everybody gets to contribute to the playlist, right? They're welcomed, they're supported, included, valued, they're actually able to participate, to come to the party, and they're welcomed when they get there. Then equity moves to everybody has the opportunity to dance. That we're giving everyone fair treatment. We're just being sure that everyone actually has access before we just move everything online, for example. We're sure that there are opportunities for advancement. We're trying to eliminate barriers and increase fairness and justice. And I'm sure I don't have to say a lot about this, given the international audience that we have, that there is not a lot of equity with a lot of these things. We gave a presentation about the book last year, and I think I found the statistic that like 50% of the world doesn't even have electricity. And here we are, talking about stable internet access, the latest and greatest computers and smartphones, and ability to access software and things that just is not necessarily the case. And so, one thing that's helped us in our thinking around this is really looking at the new materialists and the new materialist theory around the intersection between humans and non-humans, and that tools and technology have agency as well as humans having agency, in that we're co-constructing the research environment. And I think the more we can realize that it's not just a matter of we're just going to do it all on Zoom, there are no consequences to that, everybody has Zoom, that's not true. And thinking again really intentionally around what does that mean for diversity, equity, and inclusion, both on the part of the researchers, like can all researchers just go collect data on Zoom, and the participants. There might be people who don't have access to these tools, or even to a quiet space. So, I remember I teach students when I'm teaching interviewing, always do your interviews in a place that's comfortable for your participants. But what does this mean when suddenly everything is online and there might be small children around or elderly parents around? It changes, what we're able to do. New scholars, I've realized, often the younger generation, they don't see any difference between doing an interview on FaceTime and doing an interview in person. They're like, what's the difference? This is like, we're so fluent and fluid in our communication that I don't even see the consequences. But I know for somebody my age as a participant, if somebody wanted to interview me, it'd be very different doing it on FaceTime than in person. And then even, transcription choices around variation in speech, language dialects and differences, how we choose to put words on paper matters in terms of identity and representation. So those are just a few things that I think I think this is a good question, because it's not always something that people think about. And there's, again, a lot of assumptions, just like there is in our face-to-face daily lives in the workplace, a lot of assumptions around equity and inclusion that are not necessarily met. And so, we're trying to help scaffold people in their thinking around that.
Yeah, I think also that one of the things that we like to emphasize is not romanticizing technologies. I think with the mandate or the push to really reconceptualize qualitative inquiry for some folks that weren't perhaps engaging with digital tools or in digital spaces, there's always the risk, and I think this is true for all of us, but there's always this risk of the shiny new technology being positioned as doing something that is a given in relationship to equity. And so I think that what is really important is to always approach the use of digital tools and engaging in digital spaces with a critical perspective, and to bring an important critical kind of critique to its use, and not assume anything but that it might reproduce the very inequities that perhaps our research is designed to study. I think that that's an important way to enter thinking about your digital workflow. So how might a critical question might be like, how might these technologies potentially reproduce inequities or create access for some and inaccessibility for others?
Thank you. I think that that's a really good point to keep in mind, particularly when we consider ethics and research. And I know that in working with students or in designing IRBs myself, ethics and technology may not be something that we think of. And I think it really speaks to the point that y'all were talking about, that, oh, everybody has Zoom, I'll just do Zoom interviews. And if you have this plan and they don't have it, and it's more than just oh, well, now I have to use a different technology, or now I have to go find them. It can actually be an ethical issue. And I think that this ties in really well to this question of mindfulness, and that researchers be able to keep these things in mind when they adopt these technologies. So I was hoping you could speak on a little bit about how researchers can adopt digital tools and technologies in a way that keeps the concerns of access, accessibility, things like that in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think this relates really closely to the previous question. I think first and foremost, a really important beginning point for qualitative researchers is just to keep in mind that, as Trena noted, that not everyone has equal access to digital tools and or spaces. I mean, and again, that's true for qualitative researchers as well. I think that for many of us that use, as researchers use qualitative data analysis software, we often assume or perhaps forget that institutional access is variable across the world. So thinking about even our own collaborations and how we might engage in digital tools that can be supported across the different geographies that we might be working with on our research team. Those are important conversations, I think, to have up front with our collaborators, and just to acknowledge that even in our writing around technologies, and we have certainly not done this enough, but recognizing that not everyone's going to have equal access to these shiny new tools that can do some really cool things for us as qualitative researchers. And then, as Trena mentioned, in thinking about access, yes, indeed, I think that number was about 1 billion people worldwide do not have access to electricity. I think it's important to keep that in mind, given that much of the methods literature has often made this assumption that moving to a digital space or using a digital tool, it's a given that you will increase your access to research, to different research communities and different participants. And I think it's important for us to make the opposite assumption, that it's possible that our shift to an online space might delimit who can participate in our study. And so important questions, I think, that we can be asking ourselves is, in relationship to our research purpose, what are the ways that we can access the research communities and research participants that will help us make sense of whatever our phenomenon of interest is? Perhaps it's not through digital spaces and digital tools, and what does that mean? And thinking about kind of the confines of what is possible, I think, is really important. I think when thinking about accessibility of digital tools or spaces that we're using, I think, again, that it is helpful to recognize that some tools actually increase accessibility, that folks that wouldn't be participating in our study now might be. I'll speak to my own body of scholarship. I do a fair bit of work that invites folks that use other modalities to communicate other than verbalness. And so digital tools actually open up possibilities for us to interact with each other, such as through chat. If I didn't have those tools, those perspectives would not be perspectives that would be part of my data set. There wouldn't be opportunity for them to share. So there are accessibility opening spaces that happen when we thoughtfully engage with digital tools that might be particularly useful for our participants. So I think also when we think about online interviewing, given interviewing writ large is kind of the mainstay way of collecting qualitative research data, I think that it's important that we take this really critical perspective and recognize again things like, do our participants have access to the necessary technologies to participate? Do they prefer that we have videos on or off? What does that mean for our assumptions about how rapport is built? Can we build rapport without seeing each other's face? Oh my goodness, can we? So all those, those kind of core assumptions of doing qualitative work, we have to really query that in relationship to accessibility and what might it mean, and reshape even how we think about things like rapport building. A really great resource is a 2017 piece that disability studies scholars Kirschbaum and Price wrote, where they talked about how even researchers that are engaging in digital interviewing practices need to be really thoughtful about the kinds of things that they're privileging. So they use this term a normative body mind. So positioning kind of this idea that a talking head is how we make sense of people's worldviews. And they argued for thinking more broadly about how we think about even how to access how people are making sense of the world. I think that we often stop short in how we think about the use of digital tools and spaces and allowing us to really creatively invite participants to help us understand how we can effectively use digital tools, for instance, to powerfully make sense of their worldviews. Like, for instance, do they want to share images with us? Do they want to engage in drawings in a digital space? Is that a more meaningful way for them to access the digital tool and then share with us their worldview? So I think it's both asking critical questions, but then also really taking a participant-oriented perspective where we invite them to teach us around how these tools and or spaces might be most meaningfully used from their perspectives.
Would you like to add anything, Dr. Paulus?
No, those are all really good points, and captures kind of some of the conversations that we've had around this.
Great. One thing that I'm thinking as you're talking, Dr. Lester, is it seems like, especially when you're talking about this idea of broadening our perspectives and worldviews, is that it seems like researchers need to have creativity, and not only how they use these tools, how they implement them, but what they can get out of them and how they can best help their participants in using them. And so it seems like it to powerfully use them or meaningfully use them from beginning to end in a coherent research project, it's going to take a little bit of stretching on the researcher's part, a little bit of creativity, a little bit of a willingness to step out of your own box or step out of your own shoes and see how someone else engages with the world or how someone else engages with technology in a way that one, benefits your research project, but it also benefits your participants and yourself in keeping these ideas of diversity, equity, inclusion, and ethics in research in mind. So as we kind of finish up and look towards some of the questions that were left in the chat, I wanted to end just by asking y'all if there is anything else you'd like to share about the theoretical and the methodological implications of using digital tools and spaces in qualitative research.
I think just our big takeaway that we hope everyone kind of leaves today with is just to understand that technology is not neutral. And this idea of technological determinism is one that I know in American culture anyway is this big assumption that automatically whatever the best technology is, it will win, and that there aren't any consequences to that, and that obviously if something wins and we're using it and it's been adopted, it means it's for the best because it's the most efficient, or it must be for a good thing, a good reason. And that's not necessarily the case, as I think we all know, but there's always this in American culture and probably other ones too, that technology is progress and progress is always good. Now, I will say that university faculty tend to not be that way. We're often, in qualitative research, researchers are also not always that way. We tend to be a little bit more skeptical and resistant. And in fact, I know Jessica and I have spent more time trying to convince people to use technology than not. But I think with the younger generation being much more comfortable with these tools or knowing that they're out there, they've pushed us to kind of adopt more. And we really try to help people understand the consequences of those decisions. And so it's never just as simple as, well, I'm going to use Atlas TI for my data analysis. Now I'm a huge proponent of using qualitative data analysis software. I would not do research anymore without that, but I'm also privileged in that I was able to take trainings. I had colleagues to help me learn it. I have access and money to have that software. And not everybody's in that situation. And so I can't assume that my collaborators have that same privilege and ability. So part of my work needs to be to help be sure other people have access to those tools so that we can use them together. And how can I get that out to other people? So technology is not neutral. There are always consequences. For every problem that we solve with technology, we usually are creating a new unintended consequence or problem. And so just the more we can get ahead of that or be aware of that, the better. Jessica, I don't know what you also might think about final words of wisdom.
Yeah, I think one thing just to always keep in mind, particularly as for many qualitative researchers, the shift to thinking about digital tools and digital spaces seems more in our face than it has been perhaps ever before. I think one thing that's helpful for me is just this continual reminder that methodologies and methods don't stand still. They're always in the making, and I think sometimes they're written about as if they like always existed, like they're prehistoric. Case study methodology always was there. I think it's really important to recognize that the methods we use have evolved with historical moments. So like even thinking about like the shift in the use of tools where ethnographers were just using a pen and a piece of paper to record interviews. And the world wars really impacted the kinds of technologies that were being produced that eventually allowed for a recording of the interactions between people, and qualitative researchers benefited from those kind of historical products. I think the same could be said of the histories that we're all navigating in the unique geographies that we're coming from, that the methodologies and the methods that we all are co-producing are going to shift across time and certainly across our careers as well. So as the landscape shifts, so should methodologies and methods. We should wield them in ways that are relevant, not just the historical moment, but to our participants in the context we work in as well. We, in this last book that we wrote, we drew upon some of the ideas from Adams and Thompson's writing. And one of the questions that I think is really helpful in relationship to this idea of kind of shifting landscapes is this question that they pose, where they invite qualitative researchers to consistently ask how our own thinking and being and doing as qualitative researchers may be altered by whatever technology that we engage in our research practice. And I think that centers then this idea that no technology is neutral, and that we are co-researchers with the technologies that we engage in.
Thank you. I think that y'all have made some really good points over this meeting. The coherency of a project from using technology to beginning to end, the theoretical methodological implications. I like your big takeaways. Technology isn't neutral. Things are always moving. We have a few questions in the chat that we have a little bit of time to get to. The first one is, what's your advice for novice qualitative researchers, particularly in terms of using social media as a data source?
I just want to add one more quick thing, and then I'll take a first pass at that, since we both have done some work with social media. But the other big takeaway is there is a history to all of this. So assume that someone's already published something about whatever new thing it is that you're doing, right? Like, I know that there's going to be tons of articles coming out as if no one's ever done interviews on Zoom before COVID, right? And it's a shame, because Janet Salmons, for example, has published books on online interviews and how you do those well. And so I would just encourage everybody, anything new that you're doing, somebody's already written and published about, so build on that work, and you don't have to make the same mistakes that they did. If you read some of that previous literature, and it goes back to the 1980s, you might, be ahead of the pack. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Now, social media, for example, When I started working with what is now called social media, it was the late 1990s. It was not called social media then. They were called online discussions. Some of you might remember Usenet, MySpace, or even before that, just email. And so I would say my biggest piece of advice about looking at social media data as a qualitative researcher is to find a group to work with. Don't just treat that data as a free source of data that's out there in the world, right? It's hard to get informed consent from people who are talking in digital spaces if you don't know them. A lot of people try to bypass that, and I've been guilty of that myself as social media was kind of coming into play, or there are anonymous online support groups for health conditions. And it's very easy to see those spaces as free data for researchers to look at. But, as Jessica and I have had, and Liz have had conversations around this and the ethics around it, I think that it will actually benefit people more if you work with the organization, the sponsor, or the people in that community to answer research questions they have about their digital space, and you're working together with them. I think that will lead to a more ethical and meaningful data source. I would not touch Facebook with a 10-foot pole, because the legal implications of researching Facebook without unless you have the informed consent of every person in the group that you're looking at, working with more and more over the years, it's getting tougher and tougher to justify and legally and ethically look at groups like Facebook, Instagram. Twitter's kind of been free game, but it's getting harder because those companies are for profit and they have a vested interest in not necessarily wanting academics to look at those conversations as data. I could talk forever about social media, but I'll stop with that now.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'm going to put in the chat the link to the Association of Internet Researchers, and I'm linking directly to their ethics committee reports. I think that's one of the best resources out there. Obviously, given how geographically dispersed the group is here that's today, we all have different ethics boards that we have to intersect with that are really variable across geographic spaces. And this group does bring together kind of contemporary considerations of ethics in digital spaces. And I'll say that their reports generally ask more questions than give answers. And I think that captures the landscape of ethics in social media context. There are more questions than answers. It's a gray area. But having these reflexive questions in front of you as you begin to think about the implications of your work is really important.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. We have one that says, what are the challenges you've encountered using technology and doing qualitative research, and how did you mitigate those challenges?
So many challenges. So I'll just say that I'm currently involved in several projects where we are using Zoom to collect data through interviewing. And I think that brings a whole set of considerations, some of which I mentioned, like what does rapport look like in those contexts. But I'll speak to a more recent study that I collaborated with on a student where we were using Instagram-based data of public accounts. And if any of you are Instagram followers, you can look these people up. They're famous. I didn't know that at the time, but the Dolan twins are apparently Instagram celebrities. And this particular project was looking at constructions of masculinity, so drawing upon gender theories and discourse theories to make sense of this data. So it's public data, it's a public account. And we immediately encountered questions before we even went very far in the project with can we use this data? Is it legal to use this data? And so we actually, our university, and we're grateful for this resource, but we have free access to turn to legal services. And so we brought our data to a legal team, so a group of lawyers, and they actually spent a month reviewing the rules and regulations that Instagram publicly posts around the use of data. And they gave us recommendations, legal recommendations, which included in this instance that they felt we could include images within our publications of the data. We ultimately chose not to in our publication actually have the images present, partly because we had concerns around consent. So we just had the URLs. And of course, editors had questions around, is this enough? It was a discourse study. Don't you need the data present for me visually? So we, in our methods section, also included a very detailed description of the interactions we had with the legal team that led us to these final conclusions. So I don't know that that's advice other than to say that I think it's complicated for all of us. And I guess the advice is this of don't stop short of exploring the ethical concerns that might arise when you're engaged in this kind of work, be it as you're collecting data or as you're thinking about representing your findings. It's really important to just keep following any potential ethical kind of quandary that might be arising.
I love it. If Dr. Lester's university needed a month to wade through the terms of service of Instagram, I don't think the rest of us have a chance of being sure that we're actually using social media data that's proprietary in a legal way.
I think we have time for one last question, and I'll go back up and just go to the next one that was asked. Software now can process and store large volumes of data, even in doing qualitative research, not just quantitative research. So this person would like to know if you think it will change the rules for data saturation and data acquisition.
The data saturation question is an interesting one as a strategy for ensuring validity. And Jessica, I'm curious what you think of that, because I know you've just were working on a special issue around validation strategies. And I hadn't thought about software that enables storage of so much qualitative data, sort of raising the bar for data saturation. What was the second part? Data saturation and
Data acquisition.
Data acquisition. Yeah, I mean, definitely there's the whole idea of big data, and that comes from social media and other technologies that can just push so much more data to qualitative researchers. And so I haven't thought about it as much. Well, I guess I sort of have that. Yes, the software packages can support doing a lot of different things now. So again, I think it always has to be methodologically driven, but because we have, it goes both ways. Now that we have access to so much more data, we need new methods for handling it, and maybe more validation strategies that sort of match that. So what does it mean in terms of how much data you need to, I mean, it always goes back to the research question. What do you want to know? How much data do you need in order to be able to answer that question? But that's kind of, I don't actually agree with stopping. Like a lot of qualitative methods instructors will say, well, just go back to your research question. The problem is big data and the new tools enable us to answer new kinds of questions, right? So it's both sides. It's not always methodologically driven. It's that because we have access to more data and tools to use it, it changes the questions. And of course, there's a whole field on computational methods, big data, data science, data visualization. That's all really been driven by quantitative and computational work. What is our role in that conversation as qualitative researchers? We have a role. I feel like none of us have quite engaged in it to the extent that we need to, but we need to be speaking in that space. And so, yeah, Jessica, I'm curious what you might think about the validation part, data saturation part.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. And I don't know off the top of my head, I don't know that anyone's explicitly engaged in thinking about saturation in relationship to software use. I will say that the concept of saturation, though, has been heavily critiqued over the last about 15 years. And there's a piece that Michelle O'Reilly and Nikki Kiyimba wrote in the Journal of Qualitative Research that takes saturation to task. And I think, I can't remember the exact name, but I can provide it to the conference leaders, and perhaps we can send it out to the list of folks that attended. But I think thinking about that question in relationship to the critiques around saturation is also important. I'll put in the chat a recent special issue that my colleague Michelle O'Reilly and I put together on quality and qualitative research. I think, of course, whenever we're thinking about validity, quality, whatever position we take on how to name it, we also have to think around methodological theory and methods. Like we don't want tools to push us to ignore methodological assumptions. So if, for instance, we're using interpretive phenomenological analysis, there are methodological assumptions about even how the notion of validity is conceptualized and conceived. And I think that has to intersect with any question that we have around how a digital tool might be shaping conceptions of validity or quality. And then also I'll just say, and I mean, this is what a lot of literature points to, in qualitative work, I think there's always a hesitation to make an argument that more is ever better. Having more of something is allowing us to do some bigger claim, given that that does fall into, I would argue, the trap of thinking if we take up a different paradigm's argument, then we can make claims that our work is just as good, versus reconceptualizing what the notion of goodness or quality is conceived of within our own methodological framework. So anyway, all that to say, I think we have to intersect these conversations with methodological assumptions and theories as well.
Great, thank you. I really want to thank you both for your time in this discussion. I think it's been very generative and very helpful. And I also appreciate the allowing us to record it. I think Sonia has a few things that she would like to say about WCQR to wrap us up, and I appreciate everyone's time today.